Hello everyone. So in this video we're going to go over overfitting and regularization. So we've been looking at this book by Michael Nielsen, and we're currently on chapter 3 of the book, which deals with how we can improve our neural networks. So let's delve right into it. The Nobel Prize winning physicist Enrico Fermi was once asked his opinion of a mathematical model some colleagues had proposed as the solution to an important unsolved physics problem. The model gave excellent agreement with experiment, but Fermi was skeptical. He asked how many free parameters could be set in the model. Four was the answer. Fermi replied, I remember my friend John von Neumann used to say, with four parameters I can fit an elephant, and with five I can make him wiggle his trunk. This quote comes from a charming article by Freeman Dyson, who is one of the people who proposed the flawed model. A four parameter elephant may be found here. Alright. Um, so this is how. Okay. So first of all, this is saying that when you have lots of free parameters whose value you are free to choose, then you can obviously you choose them in such a way that they make your work easier. But that is not always the case that you'll have like such values in the real world, right? Or you'll be able to get equations with so many free variables. Alright. The point, of course, is that models with a large number of free parameters can describe an amazingly wide range of phenomena. Even if such a model agrees well with the available data, that doesn't make it a good model. It may just mean that's enough freedom in the model that it can describe almost any data set of the given size without capturing any genuine insights into the underlying phenomenon. When that happens, the model will work well for the existing data, but will fail to generalize to new situations. The true test of a model is its ability to make predictions in situations it hasn't been exposed to before. Right. Fermi and von Neumann were suspicious of models with four parameters. Our 30 hidden neuron networks for classifying MNIST digits has nearly 24,000 parameters. That's a lot of parameters. Our 100 hidden neuron network has nearly 80,000 parameters. And state of the art deep neural net sometimes contains millions and billions of parameters. Should we trust the results? Right, so this is a very good question. So if they are suspicious of models with even four parameters, why should we think that our model is not just being good on the training set and not generating genuine insights about the data? So let's sharpen this problem up by constructing a situation where our network does a bad job generalizing to new situations. We'll use our 30 hidden neuron network with its 23,860 parameters, but we won't train the network using all 50,000 MNIST training images. Instead, we'll use just the first 1,000 training images. Using that restricted set will make the problem with generalization much more evident. We'll train in a similar way to before using the cross entropy cost function with a learning rate of eta zero point 0.5 and a mini batch size of 10. However, we'll train for 400 epochs, a somewhat larger number than before because we're not using as many training examples. Let's use network 2 to look at the cost function changes. So they are loading the data, then they're importing network 2. So the neurons are 784 in the input layer, 30 in the hidden layer, 10 in the output layer, and using the weight initializer and then training using stochastic gradient descent. Using the results, we can plot the way the cost function changes as the network learns. So this and the next four graphs were generated by the program overfitting.py. Alright, so this is the graph. This looks encouraging, showing a smooth decrease in the cost just as we expected. Note that I've only shown epochs 200 through 399. This gives up a close-up view of the later stages of learning, which as we'll see turns out to be where the interesting action is. Let's now look at how the classification accuracy of the test data changes over time. Okay, so again I've zoomed in quite a bit. In the first 200 epochs not shown, the accuracy rises to just 82%. The learning then gradually slows down. Finally, at around 280 epoch, the classification accuracy pretty much stops improving. Later epochs merely see small stochastic fluctuations near the value of the accuracy at epoch 280. Right, we can see that it's kind of saturating. Contrast this with the earlier graph where the cost associated to the training data continues to smoothly drop. If we just look at the cost, it appears that our model is still getting better, but the test accuracy shows that the improvement is an illusion. Just like the model that Fermi disliked, what a network learns after 280 epochs no longer generalizes to the test data, and so it's not useful learning. We call the network is overfitting or overtraining beyond epoch 280. So essentially, what's happening is the cost going down would give you a sense of the model learning more, becoming better. But when you have a look at the accuracy, you see that the accuracy isn't really increasing. So if the cost is decreasing but the accuracy is not increasing, what's really happening? Is the model even becoming better? And the answer is no. After a point, it's not really becoming better, rather, it is overfitting to the data. So you might wonder if the problem here is that I'm looking at the cost on the training data as opposed to the classification accuracy on the training data. In other words, maybe the problem is that we are making an apples and oranges comparison. What would happen if we compared the cost on the training data with the cost on the test data? So we are comparing similar measures. Or perhaps we could compare the classification accuracy on both the training and test data. In fact, essentially the same phenomena shows up no matter how we do the comparison. For instance, let's look at the cost on the test data. So you can see the cost comes down but then shoots up. You can see that the cost on the test data improves until around epoch 15, but after that it actually starts to get worse, even though the cost on the training data is continuing to get better. This is another sign that our model is overfitting. It poses a puzzle though, which is whether we should regard epoch 15 or epoch 280 as the point at which overfitting is coming to dominate learning. Okay, so what they're saying is if you plot the cost on the test data, then again you see that the cost comes down for like 15 epochs and then shoots up once again. So this begs the question. So which is whether we should regard these 15 epoch or 280 epoch as the points where overfitting starts. From a practical point of view, what we really care about is improving classification accuracy on the test data. While the cost on the test data is no more than a proxy for classification accuracy, and so it makes most sense to regard epoch 280 as the point beyond which overfitting is dominating learning in a network. Another sign of overfitting may be seen in the classification accuracy on the training data. So you can have a look at the graph here. The accuracy rises all the way up to 100%. That is, our network classifies all 1000 images correctly. Meanwhile, our test accuracy tops at 82%. So our network really is learning about peculiarities of the training set, not just recognizing digits in general. So what's really happening is your model is memorizing the training data. It's not really looking for patterns anymore. It knows when it sees a specific image that this image belongs to this class rather than knowing some specific features of the image which should pertain to that class. Because if that was the case, if your model was looking for features, then there wouldn't be such a drastic difference of 100% on the training data while 82% on the testing data. All right. So this can be similar to like you memorizing some answers. We've all done that, right? For some exams, we just don't know how this derivation is going on. We can't just spend a lot of time on it. So what we end up doing, we memorize some questions which we believe have a high probability of coming in the exam, and that is when the major problem arises. Something changes in the question, it pops again, and we are unable to solve it. At least it's happened to me. So a network really, okay, it's almost as though a network is merely memorizing the training set without understanding digits well enough to generalize to the test set. Overfitting is a major problem in neural networks. This is especially true in modern networks, which often have very large number of weights and biases. To train effectively, we need a way of detecting when overfitting is going on so we don't overtrain. And we'd like to have techniques for reducing the effects of overfitting. The obvious way to detect overfitting is to use the approach above. Keep track of accuracy on the test data as our network trains. If we see that the accuracy on the test data is no longer improving, then we should stop training. Of course, strictly speaking, this is not necessarily a sign of overfitting. It may be that accuracy on the test data and training data both stop improving at the same time. Still, adopting this strategy will prevent overfitting. Right. So what they're saying is an obvious way to check overfitting is to plot these graphs and look at them and keep a track of accuracy. And if we see that the accuracy in the test data is no longer improving, then at that point we should just stop training. And there are commands in programming libraries which automatically keep track of this. So of course, strictly speaking, what they're saying is this is not necessarily a sign of overfitting. It may just be that accuracy on both the test and training data no longer improves. But still, when we have a look at this, we get a good idea. Okay. In fact, we'll use a variation on this strategy. Recall that when we load in the MNIST data, we load in three data sets. So we have the training, we have the validation, and we have the test data set, right? Okay. So up to now we've been using the training data and test data and ignoring the validation data. The validation data contains 10,000 images of digits, images which are different from the 50,000 images in the MNIST training set and the 10,000 in the MNIST test set, right? So the validation set we created from the 60,000 training set, we split out 10,000 for validation. So instead of using the test data to prevent overfitting, we will use the validation data to do this. We'll use much the same strategy as was described above for the test data. That is, we'll compute the classification accuracy on the validation data at the end of each epoch. Once the classification accuracy of the validation data has saturated, we stop training. This strategy is called early stopping. Of course, in practice, we won't immediately know when the accuracy is saturated. Instead, we continue training until we are confident that the accuracy has saturated. Alright, so what they're saying is instead of waiting for the model to train and then test on the testing data, we'll use the validation data after each epoch to see how much accuracy does the model have at this point of time. So if the model has saturated, uh, it's not improving on the validation set, then we stop training, and that is known as early stopping. So, a side note, it requires some judgment to determine when to stop. In my earlier graphs, I identified 280 as the place at which accuracy saturated. It's possible that was too pessimistic. Neural networks sometimes plateau for a while in training before continuing to improve. I wouldn't be surprised if more learning could have occurred even after epoch 400, although the magnitude of any further improvement would likely be small, so it's possible to adopt more or less aggressive strategies for early stopping. Yeah, so this was quite self-explanatory. So why use the validation data to prevent overfitting rather than test data? In fact, this is a part of most general strategy, which is use the validation data to evaluate different trial choices of hyperparameters, such as the number of epochs to train for, the learning rate, the best network architecture, and so on. We use such evaluations to find and set good values for the hyperparameters. Indeed, although I haven't mentioned it until now, that is in part how I arrived at the hyperparameter choices made earlier in the book. So more on this later. So what they're saying is this is a whole heuristic in which we use the validation data and test the model on the validation data to choose our hyperparameters such as epochs, learning rate, the network architecture, the number of neurons in each layer, and so on. So again, the author says that he'll get to the exact procedure he used to make these specific choices later. Of course, that doesn't in any way answer the question of why we are using the validation data to prevent overfitting rather than test data. Instead, it replaces it with a more general question, which is why we are using the validation data rather than test data to set good hyperparameters. To understand why, consider that when setting hyperparameters, we are likely to try many different choices for the hyperparameters. If we set the hyperparameters based on evaluation of the test data, it's possible we'll end up overfitting our hyperparameters to the test data. Yep. That is, we may end up finding hyperparameters which set particular peculiarities of the test data, but when performance won't generalize to other data sets. So what they're saying is, if we tune our model also and hyperparameters based on the test data, then we're essentially showing the answer question paper to the model, right? When we test on the model on the question paper, it will no longer be something which it has never seen before. It has already been tuned to it. So when you have a more general or a totally new data set in real world, then the performance won't be replicated. We guard against that by figuring out the hyperparameters using the validation set. Okay, I'll pause for a second. Right, I'm sorry, I got a call. Alright, so back to this part. Alright, we guard against that by fighting out the hyperparameters using the validation data. Then once we've got the hyperparameters we want, we do a final evaluation of the accuracy using the test data. That gives us confidence that the results of the test data are a true measure of how well our neural network generalizes. To put it another way, you can think of the validation data as a type of training data that helps us learn good hyperparameters. This approach to find good hyperparameters is sometimes known as holdout method, since the validation data is kept apart or held out from the training data. So what they're saying is essentially if you keep the test data separately and use it only for the final evaluation, then you get a true measure of how the model will perform on data which it has never seen before. Okay, so now in practice, even after evaluating performance on the test data, we may change our minds and want to try another approach, perhaps a different network architecture, which will involve finding a new set of hyperparameters. If we do this, isn't there a danger we'll end up overfitting to the test data as well? Do we need a potentially infinite regress of data sets so we can be confident our networks will generalize? Addressing this concern fully is a deep and difficult problem, but for our practical purposes, we are not going to worry about too much about this question. Instead, we'll plunge ahead using the basic holdout method based on the training data, validation data, and test data. Okay, so I guess this was quite self-explanatory. So let's just move on to the next section. So we've been looking at so far at overfitting when we are just using 1000 training images. What happens when we use the full training set of 50,000 images? We'll keep all the other parameters the same, 30 hidden, zero point 0.5 learning rate, 10 mini batch, but training using all 50,000 for 30 epochs. Here a graph shows the result for the classification accuracy on both the training and test data rather than validation data. So in order to make the graphs more comparable with the earlier graphs, so we can see that it's the accuracy on the training data is going as high as 98%, and the accuracy on the testing data is going as high as 95%. As you can see, the accuracy on the test and training data remain much closer together than when we were using 1000 training examples. In particular, the best classification accuracy of 97.86% of the training data is only 2.53% higher than the test data. That's compared to the 17.73% gap we had earlier. Overfitting is still going on, but it's greatly reduced. Our network is generalizing much better. In general, one of the best ways of reducing overfitting is to increase the size of training data. With enough training data, it is difficult for even a very large network to overfit. Unfortunately, training data can be expensive or difficult to acquire, so this is not always a practical approach. So what they're saying is if you compare this to the best accuracy which we had earlier, then it's just a minute error increase. It may seem to you, but this is actually quite a lot when you are nearing 100%. But that when we compared it to the gap which we had earlier, so the gap which we were getting when we had not considered overfitting, we were getting a gap of 17%. So our model is much better than before now. All right. So moving on to regularization now. So let's just have a look at how long this section is. Right. So we'll probably cover off this section. Regularization. Increasing the amount of training data is one way of reducing overfitting. Are there other ways we can reduce the extent to which overfitting occurs? One possible approach is to reduce the size of our network. Right, this makes sense. However, large networks have the potential to be more powerful than small networks, and so this is an option we'd only adopt reluctantly. So we reduce the size of a network so that our model does not overfit. But again, large networks are much better and capture much more features. Fortunately, there are other techniques which can reduce overfitting even when we have fixed network and fixed training data. These are known as regularization techniques. In this section, I describe one of the most commonly used regularization techniques, a technique sometimes known as weight decay or L2 regularization. The idea of L2 regularization is to add an extra term to the cost function, a term called a regularization term. Here's the regularized cost entropy. So this is the standard cross entropy and this is the regularized term. So we are summing over all the weights, square of weights, averaging it out, and then multiplying this lambda by 2 to it. The first term is just the usual expression for the cross entropy, but we've added a second term, namely the sum of squares of the weights in the network. This is scaled by a factor lambda by 2n, where lambda greater than 0 is our regularization parameter, and n, as usual, the size of our training set. I'll discuss how lambda is chosen. It's also worth noting that the regularization term doesn't include the biases. I'll also come back to that below. Okay, so this is the regularization term, and we've only just seen it now, but uh, as the author is saying, we'll understand how it's working. Of course, it's possible to regularize other cost functions as well in the same way. For this is the quadratic cost, or in general, this is any cost function, and then you regularize it by adding this expression. Intuitively, the effect of regularization is to make it so the network prefers to learn small weights, all other things being equal. Large weights will only be allowed if they considerably improve the performance, improve the first part of the cost function. Put another way, Regularization can be viewed as a way of compromising between finding small weights and minimizing the cost function. The relative importance of the two elements of the compromise depends on the value of lambda. When lambda is small, we prefer to minimize the original cost function, and when lambda is large, we prefer small weights. Okay, so how does this paragraph make sense? Let's just break it down. So this is your cost function and you add a regularization term. Okay, so if what it's doing is we want to minimize a cost function. So the weights will be minimized because this term is being added to the cost function. So the weights would be scaled down so that this term is minimized. Makes sense, I hope. Now again, large weights will only be allowed if they considerably improve our cost function. So if we were to get large weights, then this value of C naught should go down, right? Otherwise, our cost would be going up. So that would only occur in those cases. So put another way, we can find a compromise between the cost function minimization, the original cost function minimization, and minimizing the weights. I hope that makes sense. And now how does it depend on lambda? When lambda is small, we prefer to minimize the original cost function because this term is already small. And when lambda is large, we prefer smaller weights because then we need to minimize this term to compensate for the large lambda to reduce this term overall. Okay, so now it's really not at all obvious why making this kind of compromise should help reduce overfitting, but it turns out that it does. We'll address the question of why it helps in the next section, but first let's work through an example showing that regularization really does reduce overfitting. To construct such an example, we first need to figure out how to apply our stochastic gradient descent learning algorithm in a regularized neural network. In particular, we need to know how to compute the partial derivatives of the cost function with respect to the weights and biases for all the weights and biases in the network. Taking the partial derivatives of equation 87, which is this, gives us the partial derivative of the cost with respect to weight is the partial derivative of the cost function with respect to the weight plus lambda over n times w. So when you take the derivative, you get the twos get cancelled out, you get lambda over n and a w, because when you take the derivative, you get 2w. All right, and when you take the derivative with respect to the bias, this term just vanishes and you have the original cost function. So these can be computed using back propagation as described in last chapter. And so we see that it's easy to compute the gradient of the regularized cost function. Just use back propagation as usual and then add lambda over n times w to the partial derivative of all the weight terms. Right. The partial derivatives with respect to the biases are unchanged. And so the gradient descent rule for the biases doesn't change from the usual rule. Okay, so what this means is we are just adding this term to the partial derivative with respect to weights, and the partial derivative with respect to the bias are unchanged. So when we use gradient descent for the bias, it doesn't change, it remains the same. But when we use it for the weights, we get this extra term which we'll subtract, and since it's dependent on the weight, we can just take the weight common and we get this form. So this is exactly the same as gradient descent rule, the usual one, except we rescale the weight by a factor of 1 minus n lambda over n, eta and lambda over n. This rescaling is sometimes referred to as weight decay because the weight is going down. At first glance, it looks as though this means the weights are driving unstoppably towards zero, but that's not right, since the other term may lead the weights to increase. If so, doing causes a decrease in the unregularized cost function. Okay, so just let's read the sentence once more. But that's not right, since the other term may lead the weights to increase. If so, doing causes a decrease in the unregularized cost function. So this term would just increase the weight if doing this will decrease our unregularized cost function. Okay, because we need to minimize this unregularized cost function as well in this partial derivative. Okay, so that's how gradient descent works. What about stochastic gradient descent? Well, just as in unregularized stochastic gradient descent, you can estimate the partial derivative with respect to weights by averaging over a mini batch M training examples. Thus, the unregularized learning rule for stochastic gradient descent becomes this. So, when you did not have the regularization, you got this, but since you have the regularization now, only this term has changed slightly. You are still averaging over all of them, so you get the eta over m term here. Okay, where the sum is over training example x in the mini batch and cx is the unregularized cost for the training example. This is exactly the same as the usual rule for stochastic gradient descent except for this weight decay factor. Finally, and for completeness, let me get the regularized rule for the biases. This is of course the same because you have not really tweaked the biases or decayed the biases. Let's see how regularization changes the performance of our neural network. We'll use a network with 30 hidden neurons, 10 size mini batch, zero point 0.5 learning rate, cross entropy. This time we'll use a regularization parameter lambda zero point 0.1. So note that in the code we use the lambda variable lambda. Okay, so I don't really know how should I pronounce this, but I'll just name it lambda because the correct spelling is reserved in Python for anonymous functions if you're familiar with them. I've also used the test data again, not the validation data. Strictly speaking, we should use the validation data for all reasons we discussed earlier, but I decided to use the test data because it makes results more directly comparable with earlier unregularized results because they were based on test data. You can easily change the code to use the validation data instead and you'll get similar results. Okay, so now the cost on training data decreases over the whole time just as it did earlier in the unregularized case. But this time the accuracy on the test data continues to increase for the entire 400 epochs, so we are not seeing some saturation. Clearly the use of regularization has suppressed overfitting. What's more, the accuracy is considerably higher with a peak of 87 compared to the peak of 82% in the unregularized case. Indeed, we could almost certainly get considerably better results by considering by continuing to train past 400 epochs. It seems that empirically, regularization is causing a network to generalize better and considerably reducing the effects of overfitting. What happens if we move out of the artificial environment of just 1,000 and return to the full 50,000? Of course, we've seen already that overfitting much less of a problem with full 50,000 images. Does regularization help any further? Let's keep the hyperparameters the same as before, 30 epochs, zero point 0.5 learning rate, 10 mini batch. However, we need to modify the regularization parameter. The reason is because the size n of the training set has changed from n1000 to n50,000. And this changes the weight decay factor because the size is changed, this n has changed. So this decay factor has become considerably small. So if we continue to use zero point 0.1, this would mean much less weight decay and thus reduce the regularization effect. So we compensate it by incrementing this also by a factor of 50, which zero point 0.1 times 50 is 5. Okay, so let's train our network now. We obtain these results. So the accuracy on the testing data and the accuracy on the training data are quite close by. So that's a good news. First, our accuracy classification on the test data is up to 96.49 from 95.49. That's a big improvement. Second, we can see that the gap between the results on training and test is much narrower, running at under a percent. That's still a significant gap, but we've obviously made a substantial progress in reducing overfitting. So this means that the model is now generalizing more rather than overfitting or memorizing stuff. Okay, so finally let's see what test classification accuracy we get when we use 100 hidden neurons and a regularization parameter of 5. I won't go through the detailed analysis of overfitting. This is purely for fun, just to see how high an accuracy we can get using our new tricks. The final data is result is a classification accuracy of 97.92% on the validation data. That's a big jump from the 30 hidden neuron case. In fact, tuning just a little bit more to run for 60 epochs at eta zero point 0.1 and lambda 5, we get a 90 break the 98% barrier, and that is not bad for what turns out to be like 152 lines of code. So this was quite self-explanatory, I believe, and this was just a fun exercise kind of. So I've described regularization as a way to reduce overfitting and to increase classification accuracies. In fact, that's not the only benefit. Empirically, when doing multiple runs of our MNIST network but with different random weight initializations, I found that the unregularized runs will occasionally get stuck, apparently caught in local minimum of the cost function. The result is that different runs sometimes provide different results. By contrast, the regularized runs have provided much more easily replicable results because they do not get stuck in these uh, minimum local minimas of the cost function due to the random weight initializations. Okay, finally, why is this going on? Heuristically, if the cost function is unregularized, then the length of the weight vector is likely to grow, all other things being equal. Over time, this can lead to the weight vector being very large indeed. This can cause the weight vector to get stuck, pointing in more or less the same direction, since changes due to gradient only make tiny changes to the direction when the gradient is long. Okay, so I hope this makes sense because to change the direction uh, for instance, if you have two vectors and you change the direction with a very small vector, you add it, then the directions change very slightly. I believe this phenomenon is making it hard for our learning algorithm to properly explore the weight space and consequently harder to find good minima of the cost function. So again, this is explains why the unregularized cost function performs worse than the regularized cost function. So we'll start off with this in the next section, and probably uh, it will take another couple of videos to just get over this chapter. It's quite well written, and again, as usual, do like, share, subscribe if you like this content. Thank you.